You don't need to be a tech person to care about cybersecurity.
It's more than just about protecting networks, it's ultimately about protecting people.
The human factor in cybersecurity often gets neglected, and we are here to bridge that gap.
Are you ready to get lost in Siberia with us? So, welcome back to another episode of Lost in Siberia. We're your hosts, Annie May.
And Annika?
And today we've got a special guest on the show who's joining us all the way from the US, Dr. Matt Canham. Would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself, Matt?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm the executive director of the Cognitive Security Institute, and the Cognitive Security Institute is a community of interest of close to 1,000 practitioners and researchers from around the world. We're in 6 out of 7 continents currently and looking to expand into Antarctica whenever we can.
Who are you going to do cognitive security analysis on in Antarctica?
The penguins.
Yeah.
Penguins. We got, I think, leopard seals.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a host of interesting behaviors going on down there. So yeah, and then there's always the what is it? The secret pyramid with all the space aliens. Also,
yeah.
yeah. So
Oh,
there's that also.
I have not heard of that. Okay,
That's on
interesting.
your The world's your oyster. Yeah.
So I know you have a really interesting background and how you got to where you are now. Do you want to give us a bit of tell us a bit of a story about how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so my PhD is in cognitive neuroscience, and my focus while I was getting my PhD was really in human-computer interaction. So my research spans everything from interface design through to my dissertation was actually on online distributed teams and how those function because back when I was getting my dissertation, that was still kind of a new thing. So after that, I ended up taking a bit of a turn and went into cybercrime investigation for the Department of Justice and spent about almost 8 years doing that. And I really knew nothing about cybersecurity or cybercrime investigation prior to that. They pretty much taught me, what I needed to know. The thing that struck me though was after I went through all the training, they sent me to, investigator school, but then they also sent me to SANS, if you're familiar with the SANS courses. And the thing that really struck me when I got into the field, because I was expecting to get out there and, investigate the hackers in the basements and all that kind of stuff. And what I found was the vast majority of cases that I was looking at were phishing and business email compromise scams. And I mean, these are things that, yes, they can be done out of a basement, but they can be done out of a basement by a 13-year-old. They were not complicated scams. And I very, very quickly realized that this is a human factors problem. It's not a technology problem. And what I mean by that is that the way that the threat actors were gaining access to these systems, it was through some sort of human. Either a human was committing some sort of error and leaving a system exposed, or they were being tricked or manipulated into taking an action that would then give threat actor access to that system. In fact, of the time that I was in the field, there was only one case that I ever investigated that was purely a technical attack, and that was really an exceptional sort of case. And so basically, the University of Central Florida then offered me a position as a research professor with the behavioral cybersecurity program. And so I went ahead and jumped out of the investigative area and went back into academia in this behavioral cybersecurity program and started researching as an academic the really high risk users. And so this is colloquially termed sometimes as repeat clickers. And so I was really looking at what is this, very small subset of user populations that are responsible for the majority of incidents. And at the time, we were specifically looking at simulated phishing campaigns, essentially. And what we were finding was that there was around like 3 to 5% of users, and this is across several different organizations, and that 3 to 5% of users would be responsible for anywhere between 30 and almost 45% of all of the incidents. And so, when you start to do the math on that, what you're finding is that it would be roughly 95% of all of the campaign failures. And so these are people who, click on a link, download an attachment, enter credentials into a false site. Of that whole circle of that Venn diagram, 95% are only, and I'm going to call it a failure. I know that there are reasons people don't call these failures, but just a failure of that test. Most people will do that once or twice, 95%. But then you have this other, 3 to 5% that will fail not 3 times, 4 times, but I've personally talked to people who have failed 17 out of 20 exercises in a 1-year period of time. And so this was really interesting to me because from a security defender standpoint, my ROI is so good if I can address this subset of users. If I can somehow fix that, now, I'm getting several times return, whereas painting this broad brush of security awareness training on the general population, it's questionable as to how effective that's going to be on somebody who makes a mistake once and then never makes it again because they had that experience of clicking on that thing. I do want to make a point, though, very quickly, because there have been a couple of papers that have come out on the academic side in the last year or two that have said, basically have made the argument that awareness training is not effective at all. But one of the things that I see that's neglected in that, though, is that experience of clicking on the thing and then getting that surprise message, that's actually very effective for probably 90 or 95% of all of the employees, because, as I said, they're only having these failures once or twice, and then they're good. I'll pause there, but that's where my academic focus went. And then about 3 years ago, we started this nonprofit called the Cognitive Security Institute, which again is a community of interest around people who do research or practice in this area. And so I would say right now we're probably real close to half and half. People who do just pure research, they have a PhD in something, and then the other half who are really in one of two areas. They're really trying to defend human employees within an organization, or we have a lot of people who are involved in defending against cognitive warfare attacks as well. And so on the surface, these seem like very different things, but when you sort of peel behind the layers, there principles behind these two things are very, very similar. And I think that's why we have this representation of two sort of distinct groups there.
That's a very interesting way to get to the human factor in cybersecurity. And when you said, oh, I did cybercrime, I was like chuckled inside because I always introduce myself like I'm Annika and I like cybercrime research. And I really enjoyed also reading your paper on the phishing simulations and really enjoyed your framing of how not all cyber scam victims are the same and how everyone is very different in their comprehension. I also participate or actually run our cybersecurity awareness campaign, and we do have repeat clickers or high-risk learners, and as you mentioned them. And it's a very interesting topic because I do feel that there are a lot of organizations as well that provide training, and they also want to give more training to people who are repeat clickers. But I understand from your research that may not necessarily be the thing that will work the best. What do you think is the biggest thing that organizations currently miss around cybersecurity awareness training, especially when it comes to this specific cohort that is quite dangerous, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, there is no sort of magic silver bullet that's going to take care of all of the repeat clickers in your organization. What I've really found is that there are different reasons that they're susceptible. However, one of the things I think that is the most interesting is in the interviews that I've done, because I've done a little bit of both quantitative and qualitative research. The quantitative being just the numbers, looking at as many as I can and looking at very rough behaviors. The qualitative being sitting down with them one-on-one for a 1 hour or more interview and just asking them. And the thing that was the most surprising to me when I was doing those interviews was that every single one of them knew the policy They knew how to spot a phishing email. They were reciting all of the stuff in the lessons perfectly. And so that was really interesting to me because it told me that yes, they have the requisite knowledge. They're just not, excuse me if I slip into academic geek speak here for a second, but they're not activating the requisite knowledge that they need in
Mm.
order to avoid these threats, right? And so, and I can actually tell a quick story about that, which is something that I think is pointing to what the underlying cause is, even though I haven't really had the opportunity to do research in this area. However, one of the things I was looking at in the research was personality factors. And the way that I was collecting the information is about 1 week before I would do the interview with the repeat clickers, I would send them a personality assessment. And there was like Big Five, there was intrinsic locus of control.
Mhm.
So do you feel like, you're in control of your destiny, or do you feel like
Mm.
the universe is kind of pushing you around and you're just sort of a leaf in the wind? And those are sort of the two extremes. And then also looked at something called need for cognition, which is the need that somebody has to question something that they're seeing, right? So, and there were one or two other tests that I had in there, but those were the big three: was the Big Five: personality, need for cognition, and locus of control. At the end of this assessment, I very plainly explained, we want to collect this anonymously, but we want to be able to connect your personality information that we just asked you about with the interview that we will be doing with you in about 1 week's time. So please give us a code word that you will remember. It doesn't need to be complex or smart or anything. You just need to remember it, because we're going to ask you for this code word in a week's time so that we can marry up your data. Okay, so I was looking at two groups. One group was what we call the protective stewards, which was the exact doppelganger opposite of the repeat clickers. These are people who never failed a single simulation, but they repeatedly reported. So in this case, we had people who had
Mhm.
reported 20 out of 20 simulated campaigns. Every single one of the protective stewards remembered their code word. Every single one of the repeat clickers forgot their code word. So I started to think maybe there's something there. And this is what I haven't really had the opportunity to go back and to do more extensive memory assessments or other things. The other thing that was very interesting about the repeat clicker population was that with the protective stewards, every single one of them had a very fluid relationship with their email. And what I mean by that is that they would check it on their devices, like their mobile devices. They would check it on desktop. They would check at 1 a.m. in the morning. They would check during the day if they were at lunch, whatever, didn't matter. Very fluid. Every single one of the repeat clickers had a very regimented relationship with email. They wouldn't check outside of work hours. They wouldn't check on mobile devices. They wouldn't check on their break. They wouldn't check on lunchtime. So it was only certain times that they would deal with emails relating to work. Now, this is where I'm speculating because I have no evidence to support this. But with a background in cognitive science, my hypothesis is that there might be a common underlying variable driving both of these, meaning that if someone, let's say, had a little bit of a memory deficiency, I'm not trying to denigrate anyone, that was leading them to, say, not recognize threats, or if they were insensitive to threats or whatever, that common underlying factor then might be compensated with a regimented schedule. If you ever have seen this movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, if you notice, the character in there who has very severe autism compensates by having a very regimented schedule. And I'm not saying that these are the same, but what I am saying is that's a form of compensating for a cognitive deficiency.
Mm.
And so, anyways, me completely speculating, I would love to do that research if somebody listens to this and wants to fund that. That is one thing that I think could really help. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so repeat clickers have bad memories and they don't check their work emails outside of work. Is that basically it in a nutshell?
I don't know if I would say bad memories, but they have some sort of a memory, issue. Well, and so where this comes to, like, where I've been experimenting with interventions is that if you're familiar with System 1, System 2 cognition, this became popularized in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And by the way, it was actually Keith Stanovich that that coined that term, System 1, System 2. I just need to put that out there as a cognitive scientist. It bugs me when people attribute it to
We'll
Kahneman.
put it in the show notes.
Yeah. Kahneman popularized the idea, but Keith Stanovich actually came up with it.
Yes.
Anyways, but System 1 is an older, faster system, meaning that basically pick any animal and they're going to pretty much operate on System 1 cognition, very associative, so stimulus response types of engagements, right? But the advantage to System 1 is it happens very, very quickly and without almost any conscious thought. System 2 is very slow, very deliberate, and this is what we think about when we think of thinking. It's a conscious thought process, maybe even internal dialogue sort of thing, and you need both. But if you relied exclusively on System 2, you wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning because you'd be so busy processing every single thing about, like, well, how do I lift the covers off the bed? How do I slip my feet into slippers? So on and so forth. So when things become a routine, they get moved into System 1 cognition. So what my hypothesis was about the repeat clickers was that System 2 cognition seems to be working just fine. Like, they could repeat all of the rules and they could tell us all the guidelines that they needed to adhere to in order to spot phishing emails. But they weren't actually practicing that in their behaviors, which is a very key point for organizations to pay attention to, right? Because it's the behaviors, it's not the knowledge that we want to change. And so what I've started doing is actually training repeat clickers, trying to train their System 1 cognition. So by basically just giving them repeated exposure to the things that they're trying to avoid and then giving very fast feedback. So the analogy I would make right with this would be like, say, martial arts. If you're trying to block a punch or something like that, the way that you get good at that is by doing it over and over and over again, getting a lot of reps. And so I'm using a similar approach with the repeat clickers.
So it kind of reminds me of when you're talking about, how people don't follow policies even though they're fully aware. It's kind of like Jaden's company Maro, how they're trying to solve that problem with having their little character that is questioning you as you're making those decisions on your computer, which I think is a really cool way to do it, because it's not actually blocking you from doing stuff, but it's actually trying to change that behavior, trying to make you think about what you're doing rather than just being like, no, you can't do that, because that doesn't really stop that person from then doing the same thing at home in their own environment outside of work. So I think it's interesting, that whole like trying to understand people's behavior and then trying to work out how we can prevent that from happening. Because I think the problem is with, especially when a lot of cybersecurity people who do focus on the technology side, it's just about calling those people out and saying, oh, well, they're stupid and they should have known better, blah, blah, blah. But, we all make mistakes in our day-to-day lives outside of technology. I might be not looking where I'm going and I trip over a rock or something and fall over. It's like, oh, well, yeah, I probably should have been looking where I was going. But yeah, like you said, I was probably, when you get used to doing stuff, it goes into System 1 and you're not thinking about it.
That's exactly it. I'm not saying that these people don't exist, but I did not talk to anyone who expressed any sort of negligence, I guess, or anything that would indicate any sort of deliberate negligence. And so everyone I spoke to, it seemed like they were very interested in keeping their organization secure. It's just that there was that disconnect.
And that's very interesting. You mentioned routine, because in Canberra it's like 3 degrees this morning, so we're getting into our winter time now.
Celsius, by the way, not Fahrenheit.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
So I just thought I'd clarify that. I was like, otherwise that'd be really cold.
Oh, it's getting closer and closer to zero. So in criminology, they claim to have, in research, they claim to have the routine activity theory, or the RAT, as the primary factor of victimization in cyber scams. And so you're saying that for people who don't actually recognize the phishing emails, it's because they haven't gotten into the routine of recognizing it. And so they do have a routine though around checking their emails. So it actually does fit with the theory on criminology, with the routine activity theory. So maybe there is something there. You're nodding like you know what I'm talking about. Is there something you
No,
can
no,
also
actually,
Yeah.
I've never heard of the routine activity theory, but now that you've said that, I'm like, yeah, the
Yeah.
light bulb's going off. I need to look into this. Yeah, no, that's really an interesting idea because, again, this is something I have not had the opportunity to explore, but I do wonder if that sort of an intervention might be very effective. Like when you check an email, when you open up an email, go through these 3 to 4 steps sequentially. And if these are very routine oriented people, then that might be a very effective way to approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they talk about how, for example, if you walk every day at 10 a.m., you go to the shop, you buy a carton of milk, and then you go back. Then if you do have a motivated attacker and the lack of a guardian, again, academic speak. So like if somebody does want to attack you, which we have so many, as you said, it's not just the basement people, it's the 13-year-olds that can draft phishing emails and probably AI agents now. We also have essentially no capable guardian. So as you're saying, there is no intervention in there. So they're going about their routine. There is no intervention, as you mentioned, Anime, for example, with Maro, that agent could help and intervene, but that's not happening. And so the continuous loop goes on their system too, without the system one intervening. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things I think that's really interesting about using this agent approach, this guardian angel or guardian agent almost, is I mean, phishing, as far as I'm aware, through email vectors is still, I think, the number one means of compromise. And it probably will be for some time because it's just such a cheap and easy way to do an attack. But I think we're also very quickly moving towards, and we're seeing it, right? More voice phishing, or through text message, or even like what we're on right now, right? Video calls with deep fakes. And so by having that guardian agent sitting there, we can help to protect against or intervene against new and emerging attacks. And I think that's one of the things we're going to see with AI, right? Is that we're going to see new attack surfaces pop up that we had not anticipated.
Yeah, we're talking about AI agents as well. That's going to become a massive attack vector if people are talking to each other or completing tasks, putting themselves out of that loop. I think you mentioned that in your B-sides talk, how you were saying, you were talking at the start about how much time we save now from not having to do those routine tasks that we used to do manually. You had to go to a shop to pay your bill, or you had to stand somewhere waiting for your friend and hope that they turned up because you didn't have a mobile phone. Like, I remember doing that when I was in school, because I think I got my first mobile phone when maybe I was in kind of late primary school. But yeah, before that, you would just be like, hey, be there at this time, and hope that they'd show up. And if they didn't, you're like, well, I guess I'll go to the movie by myself then. We're talking about phishing attacks, but then if someone is able to poison an AI agent, then how do we then train people to be aware that that in itself could be an attack vector?
Right. Well, and so this gets to the heart of why we have the Cognitive Security Institute, not the Human Risk Institute or the Human Security Institute, because, well, let me explain first that my background, my degree in cognitive neuroscience, it was a very interdisciplinary program. And so my very first quarter of that program, we were building multi-layer perceptrons, which were neural networks, to basically model human vision as a system. And so throughout my graduate career, I really developed with the perspective of looking at cognition independent of what we call the agent. And so the agent is typically a human, but it could be a cat. It could be an AI. It could be, a host of things that understands. And basically, what an agent does is it takes in information from its environment, and it could be a virtual environment. It processes that information and then, I'll say, decides, but it makes some sort of update or it makes some sort of decision process based on that information. And then it acts upon its environment. And again, its environment could be completely virtual, digital. When we look at it from that perspective, what you just mentioned about now the agent can become that vector of an attack, right? Well, you're absolutely right, because now we have a human attack surface, we have an agentic attack surface, but then we also have the attack surface of these two things combined, which is a socio-technical system, or it could be, we're also referring to this as a human AI team. And so when we look at why that becomes important is, I'm going to assume that everybody listening to this is probably pretty familiar with social engineering and the whole host of attacks pointed towards humans. The thing that's really interesting is that a lot of those same attacks will work on language-based AI systems. And so there are things that look very much like a social engineering attack that are used to inject prompts or to otherwise jailbreak a large language model or a language-based AI agent. And I can get into reasons why that happens, but just sort of leaving that on the shelf for a second, if someone's personal AI agent is compromised, and we all have, let's just assume in the future, a year or two from now, everyone has an AI agent, and this is as common, let's say, as having your own mobile device. And this thing just sort of follows you day in and day out, and it's a thing that you develop a personal relationship with, right? So right now we have something internal that I'm not going to say the name because I don't want to open up an attack surface, but we have given this AI agent a gender, it's a she, and we talk to her on a regular basis, right? And it's really helpful, but at the same time, it's strange because my system 2 cognition is very much aware that this is an AI agent that I'm using as a tool, right? My system 2 cognition thinks of it as a her, as an assistant, and I can't help it, but I develop a sense of trust in that agent. However, if that agent becomes compromised and now becomes an insider threat, it can be very easily weaponized against me. And that's where these things become very dangerous, right? Because there's not always this outward signal to notify you, the eyes don't suddenly turn red, the thing glitches out, right? It's like it looks exactly the same as it always has, and it's responded the same as it always has. And anyone who's dealt with a hallucination from an AI understands that these things appear very coherent, but they're nonsense, right? And the thing that we hope is that it's nonsense, that it's not deliberate malicious information. And that's what we need to worry about is the attack surface of the human, the attack surface of the agent, but then the attack surface of that socio-technical system.
Is this agent somehow related to Eliza, the 1960s bot that was created as a first therapy bot, by any chance?
Not at all related, but I may have been inspired by partially, yes.
Yes. I studied just as a minor, but anthropology of cybersecurity, and we've covered Eliza as a therapy bot, which was a very interesting exercise, and just interesting to hear how the creator of that has gone his whole life trying to get people to not use AI as therapy after that. And it was so interesting to hear as well in your B-Sides talk about how you can use emojis to influence AI's language, or context that you are giving it. And it works really differently from like trying to hack a code, because you can't, I can't imagine a hacker being like, put more emojis in the exploit. But it's like you're trying to actually influence the neural networks, right? And the language that the agent is built on. And you've spoken about the information that is given to you, you're hoping that it's not malicious. But I guess the other half of your institute is also dealing with cognitive warfare. So we are talking about malicious injection of information.
Matt, would you briefly just give a definition of what cognitive warfare is? Because I think a lot of people wouldn't know.
No, I cannot.
Fair enough.
It's really, it is challenging because it's like a fish trying to describe water. It's something we're in the middle of right now. I literally have a 1-hour lecture on this that I'm still having a hard time getting it condensed into an hour. But essentially, I'll try to summarize it as best I can, in that we all know that we can influence one another. And now that we all have these devices that are all connected, it becomes much easier to create and launch campaigns that are individually tailored to specific people, but en masse, right? So everybody gets their own personal message that causes them to act in a similar way. Rage bait, for being an example, let's say. But using these things that are established now in our modern society to create effects that would achieve wartime objectives would be kind of the way that I would describe that. And so to take a step back, when we look at things like World War II, a common target of strategic bombing was the factories. And when we think about World War II was an industrial age war. And so the way that a nation disables a country's ability to affect war is to basically disrupt or destroy that industrial capacity. You take a step back in history a little bit, and we had agrarian based societies that were agriculturally based, right? You look at what happened at that point, an army would come in and they would burn all the crops and salt the fields, right? And that's disabling that culture, that society's ability to grow crops or livestock. In our modern age, we've used this term information age, but we're really moving more to what I would argue is almost a cognitive age, right? Because we talked about things like smartphones and smart refrigerators and smart cars and all the rest, right? What we really meant was that these things were connected. But what we're really moving to is a true period of time where these things will have some sort of intelligence. We're already seeing AI being pushed to the edge in mobile devices, right? And so we're really getting to this point where the ability to make effective decisions is becoming more and more important. And by being able to disrupt or destroy that ability to make decisions, and we can get into how that can happen, but it's that ability to destroy or disrupt the ability to make decisions, humans or an AI, that's the objective of cognitive warfare. So I hope I did a decent job of explaining it without without being succinct.
Okay, so the ability to disrupt decisions, if we want to summarize it.
I'm going to write that down. I'll use that to my lecture coming up.
Yeah.
An ability to disrupt, I guess, like effective decision making that is
Mm.
based on information that is verified and to some extent true as information can ever be. But it's also done in the interest of a particular nation that is at war, however war is defined in our age right now.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would say it's necessarily a nation because we
Okay.
do have a non-nation state, a terrorist group or whatnot. But yes,
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Attempting to disrupt things in a way that would be quite destructive, but
Yeah.
not necessarily on a country. Yeah.
And so connecting to the decision making, I briefly read one of I think it was a co-authored paper of yours, and it was on ambiguous self-induced disinformation attack works, or the ACID with an S, right? It's just such an interesting perspective on it, because I don't know how many people think about misinformation is information on a regular basis, but we always think, oh, it's something that is being injected into your brain constantly, but actually it's not necessarily how it works, right?
right. Let me explain the acid attack very quickly because I think this is important. Well, we have two ways of sort of understanding the world. One is through a bottom-up process where it's data-driven and we're just sort of taking it in. And the other, and I would argue more common way, is through top-down processing or knowledge-driven processing, where we're taking our prior beliefs and expectations and imposing those onto the world. Take a traffic light, red, yellow, green. Those are completely ambiguous colors. There's no reason that one should signify go versus stop, right? But we have learned this association, and because of that, now when we see these colors, sometimes even if they're pulled away from that traffic light example, we impose that meaning on those, right? And in the paper itself, we actually give an example where there's something that looks like, I think it's maybe like the letter E and a 3, and depending on what's on either side of it, you see a different thing, right? This is very important because what the acid attack is essentially saying is that expectation can then be leveraged by a malicious actor to inject something that would be ambiguous information. It's some sort of ambiguous text, a story, or a picture, but it will be interpreted very differently based on your expectations. Now, let me give you a cognitive warfare example of this, right? I'm going to be very careful in how I phrase this because I very deliberately try to avoid political discussions. However, vaccinations. Now, right now, there are two very distinct camps on the view on vaccinations, right? And I've given this example in different talks I've given. I throw up a picture of Dr. Anthony Fauci from the Center of Disease Control, retired from that, and it's just a picture. There's no text, there's nothing. And I tell people this picture, it will present a very different affective trigger to these two groups because of their narrative orientation, because of their expectations and their worldview, right? This is very important to understand because one of the things I see governments generally falling down on right now is that they will put out the message on whatever topic it is, right? With no consideration on how that message is being interpreted wildly differently by different sides. And I think that this represents probably one of the greatest threats to our modern society, because if you want to split a society apart, you just need to understand where these cleavages are in the groups, and then you can start to inject this ambiguous information, and it's perfect for giving plausible deniability, right? Because the threat actors can say, well, it's just a picture of Anthony Fauci. We didn't put any disinformation there.
Mm.
However you interpret it, that's on you, right? And this is where I get a little bit uncomfortable with the mis and disinformation paradigm, because from my perspective, there really doesn't have to be any mis or disinformation involved. Now, I'm not saying that mis and disinformation are not a problem or that they're good things. I'm just saying that this is much broader than that. And then actually the truth can be used much more effectively by a threat actor than mis or disinformation can be.
Yeah, I think that's a good example too with the whole COVID thing, because I think if I saw a picture of the guy who was the head of head of health for the Victorian government when I lived in Melbourne, that guy still gives me nightmares. So I completely, yeah, like it's exactly the same thing. Like, especially because Melbourne was the most lockdown city in the whole world during COVID. So it's definitely really triggering for people. Yeah, for sure.
Interestingly, I just read this story this morning. I don't think it was you all. I think it was New Zealand is starting to talk about lockdowns because of the petrol crisis, and
Oh
people
God.
are already starting to sort of have flashbacks from COVID era lockdowns.
A lot of the times we're talking in our podcast about the human factor in cybersecurity, I guess the cognitive security factor, and how people always call humans the weakest link without trying to really understand them. And you're taking a very different approach to this.
So let me tie cognitive warfare back to more of a human-centered cybersecurity perspective, but very specifically malicious insider threat, which sometimes is disambiguated. I don't know, but anyway, one company I consulted with at one point was experiencing a malicious insider, and this was a petroleum company, and the malicious insider had been influenced by anti-petroleum messaging, I guess is what I'll call it, to persuade them that the company that they're working for was evil and it needed to be acted against or acted upon. And so, again, one of the struggles with this is that I think to really understand it, you need to pull yourself out of any personal feelings you have towards either of these things and just understand them as competing narratives. And so if we understand this as one narrative is, I'm just going to call it pro-petroleum industry, and the other narrative is anti-petroleum industry, this is a great example of how an individual can be influenced within a particular organization to take actions that are harmful to the organization and potentially themselves based on the influence of this messaging. Something I'm watching right now very carefully is the messaging around data centers. There's an environmental impact of data centers that's undeniable. I mean, we have seen the impact in the United States where groundwater tables have dropped, other things have happened, local ecosystem damage. It's factual, there's no dispute. However, we're seeing a counter I'll call it a counterculture emerge, pushing back against the creation of new data centers. And there's a narrative that goes with that. And there's a narrative that says that we should have AI superiority, right? Take an external actor, and I'm going to stay very vague here, but an external actor that might be competing for AI superiority. Well, it may benefit that foreign actor to then fuel the fire of protesting against the creation of new data centers. And so this is how cognitive warfare works. And again, I'm deliberately not taking a side on these two narratives, but I'm showing how even a well-intentioned or benign narrative can be weaponized by an external actor for their own benefit. And that's what we're seeing right now around the world in terms of cognitive warfare. And it happens both sides of the equation here, right? In North Korea, you're not allowed to think of the dear leader as mortal, right? That is a deity. And so narratives that go against that are a form of cognitive warfare against the DPRK.
I just want to touch quickly as well, because I know we don't have much time left, but I know you also have some very exciting news. You're launching the first cognitive security conference this year in Vegas, which is very exciting, which I believe is during Summer Hacker Camp. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you very much for that. So if any of these topics interest you, this is exactly the sort of thing that we're going to be discussing at the first Cognitive Security Conference in Las Vegas, August 6th and 7th. That's a Thursday and Friday. And we'll be at the Tuscany Resort and Hotel. Yeah, we're going to have several speakers. We're going to be announcing very shortly. And we're going to have essentially 3 tracks is what we're thinking right now. A human-centered cybersecurity track, a cognitive warfare track, and then a third track on neurosecurity. So looking at securing brain-computer interfaces, and we're going to have a cyborg give a talk there, a human cyborg, and yeah, and potentially someone talking about direct neural attacks as well.
Oh, cool. So is that overlapping with DEF CON?
It overlaps one day with Black Hat and one day with DEF CON.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So.
it's not too bad. Yeah.
You were thinking about cognitive warfare, and then I thought you mentioned World War II as well briefly when you were describing, I think, cognitive warfare in general. And I was thinking, oh, this is all very new and terrifying. But I was like, oh, it's not necessarily brand new. It's just in a different format now, because a lot of World War II was also about cognitive warfare, but it was just done on a different scale and on a different level. And now it's all really scaling up.
Read a book called How to Win an Information War. And it's all about these anonymous, quote unquote, shortwave operators that were operating throughout Europe on the propaganda war during World War II. It is so funny to read these things, because as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking Twitter or X or whatever it is now, and how there are these sort of anonymous actors that are putting out this messaging kind of back and forth. And it's so reminiscent of what's happening today.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Everyone always thinks what's happening now is new, but it always just cycles through. Whatever's happened now, in some form it happened in the past. It's just in a different format now.
I do think that what makes today different are the algorithms and the personalization. That's something that didn't exist before.
Seeing your talk, and I think, like, from reading, your work, I was like, you sit in a very dark space, but then I was seeing your talk and presenting, and I was like, you seem like and obviously talking to you for this hour, you seem like such a happy and a bubbly person. And it's such a dark topics that we discuss right now, but what gives you hope that we can actually build better cognitive security resilience? Yeah.
Well, so let me answer that in a really dark way, right? But the word apocalypse, it means sort of like the end, but it also means like the reveal also. And I think in a lot of ways, what we're going through right now is an apocalypse. It's maybe not like the nuclear war type of thing that we envision, but it's the end of an era. And we're coming into something brand new. And make no mistake, I think we're living in very dangerous times right now, I think. However, also very exciting, right? Because there's a lot of potential. I can imagine a very positive future 20 years from now. I can imagine a very dark future 2 years from now. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at, is the near horizon is going to be a bit dark, but I think our kids are going to grow up in a world that's much better than ours. Pre-World War II, people were still getting around on horseback for the most part. After World War II, feelings on the petrol industry withstanding, we were able to fly around the world in less than a day. Annie Mae, you came to the US and spent 2 weeks and traveled around. That would not have been possible in the year 1900, or at least it would have been much, much more difficult, right? Because steamship back and forth, you're looking at what, 6 to 8 weeks, and and then horse and buggy, and all that kind of stuff getting around in the States. It would have been very, very difficult. And now it's within the realm of leisure of non-royal class people. We have to see how this is going to turn out. It could turn out very badly, but I think it also could turn out very productively. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think that's a good note to end on, kind of like a positive
positive
outlook on
apocalypse.
the world.
Yeah, but it's like the death tarot card. It's a good card. People get the death card and they're like, oh no, I'm going to die. And it's like, no, you're going to change.
Yeah.
And it's good. Change is good. Mostly.
And also, the only thing inevitable in life is death, so...
Yeah.
There you go.
The only person thing. Yeah.
Can't top that note.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Matt, for coming on the podcast today and sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been great being here.
And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Lost in Siberia.
And we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.